Okay. Well, thank you so much, Agueda, and hello, everyone. Thank you for making the time to be here today. It's such a delight to be among a group of forward thinking public sector leaders, and I'm very grateful to Agueda, to Beth Novak, and the whole Innovate US team for giving me the opportunity, to share a few thoughts on a topic that is, near and dear to my heart, and hopefully to yours as well, which is how do we build organizations that are fundamentally more capable and more vital. Now, we only have an hour together, and as Agueda mentioned, we're gonna carve out some a good chunk of time for discussion. So there's there's only so much that I will be able to cover, and a lot will be left unsaid. And so apologies in advance for that. But if you want to go a little bit deeper on some of the topics I'll get into today, shameless plug for my book, Humanocracy, which Agueda mentioned earlier. There's a massively updated edition that will be coming out in just 6 days. So uh, put that on your radar screen if you're interested in this. And by the way, one of the things we'll do at the end of the session, perhaps tomorrow, is send to you the kind of preface in chapter one. So the first 45 or so pages of the book, in case you want to get started before the thing gets released. All right. So that's all the intro I'm going to do. And maybe the first question, maybe I want to start with a question, which is this. As you think about the organization you're part of, how would you complete the sentence? Think about that for a moment. I wish my organization were more blank. What would you fill the blank with? Right, and maybe we can come back to this in the Q&A, but I imagine some of you might say more flexible or more agile or more customer centric or more equitable, more diverse. There are lots of different very worthwhile qualities that you could put in here, and they're all, as I said, very good. I mean, I'll give you my answer, which is more human. And this probably sounds like a stupid thing to say because, like, of course, organizations are filled with human beings, right? By the way, I recently saw a piece talking about executing strategy through people. I'm like, is there an alternative? Have we figured out how to do this with monkeys? Of course it's people. But I'm trying to say something a little different here, which is that we've ended up with organizations that are in many cases less capable than the people inside them. And that's a big problem that I think can only be fixed by going back to first principles in how we design, manage, and lead our organization. And that's really what I'd like to talk about today. I wanted to share 6 propositions that are kind of meant to, maybe stretch your thinking a little bit and reconsider what's possible when it comes to leading, managing, and organizing, as well as leave you with some practical kind of tips and things you can do to get started in your own organization. So that's the plan, right? So I'm going to try to kind of unpack these 6 propositions, and then we'll have ample time to discuss. So if that makes sense, let's start with number 1, which is that the most successful organizations over the next decade or so will be the ones that evolve the way they're managed and the way they're led in ways that make them much more capable. Now, whether it's dealing with risks of geopolitical tensions or economic dislocation, or the potential benefits from emerging technologies, there are a myriad of challenges and opportunities, and tackling these is really what will determine the fate of us as a species, right? Our ability to address these problems. And since we need to address these as collectively, it really has to do with how we're organized and build organizations that are much more vital. And by vital or capable, what I really mean is organizations that are courageous. They're animated by a bold, pioneering spirit. Organizations that are adaptable, they're resilient, they're able to pivot quickly as circumstances change, that they're creative, they're able to generate new innovation and new ways of solving problems, and that are also quite inspiring. They're able to amplify and elicit a lot of human initiative and ingenuity. Now, there are organizations that embody these characteristics, in all sectors, including the public sector. My favorite example in recent years, which we feature in the new edition of Humanocracy, is Operation Warp Speed, right? Here was a massive government effort with a ridiculously ambitious goal, right? Which is to develop and distribute a vaccine in 8 months as opposed to the typical decade. And instead of kind of going through the typical organizational playbook, which is, very top down, very control driven, they push authority to the front lines. They use peer-to-peer networks to coordinate hundreds of partners, all really focused on prioritizing progress over kind of respecting protocols, and the impact was truly staggering, right? Just in the first year following approval, the COVID vaccine saved 1 million lives and prevented 10 million hospitalizations. So when organizations reflect the best that we can bring uh, uh, to work, they can accomplish amazing things. And it's not to say that we don't see those examples, right? But in my experience, when faced with new challenges and opportunities, few organizations typically display them. And that is my proposition number two, right? That often organizations are too timid, too inertial, right? Too kind of incremental and hidebound and kind of emotionally dispiriting, kind of dead zones where people are not really passionate. And, as I said, this might come across as a strong statement, but in the book, we provide plenty of examples and evidence of this. Let me focus on the last one, this idea that organizations are not really good at switching on people. And in a way, this is the core of the problem, because if you don't have that, then it's hard to have creativity. It's hard to have agility, and hard to have kind of daring, right? It's in a way the foundational problem. And I wanted to share with you some data on engagement. Comes from Gallup. They've been doing this for years and years, and it's super depressing if you care about people at work. This is global data. The U.S. data isn't that much better, but basically, quarter of people are truly engaged in their jobs. So the vast majority kind of shows up and goes through the motions, and there's a cohort that is actually kind of disengaged, kind of sabotaging the organization in some way or another. And when I first started looking at this data many years ago, my assumption, was, some work, it's really about the job. Some work is not very inspiring. You probably see people every day who are doing things that you're glad you don't have to do, right? And I hope you tell them thank you for that, right? But actually, when you ask people, are you satisfied with the actual work you do? The vast majority say they're very or somewhat satisfied with the actual task. So how do you explain this gap between kind of endemic lack of engagement on the one hand and the fact that, the work itself is not so bad, right? So let's maybe peel the onion a little bit here, get some more data. So this is another Gallup survey that shows that 1 out of 2 people say they had to quit their jobs, to get away from an incompetent or tyrannical manager. And another large study, more than a third said they would take a significant pay cut if they could fire their boss, right? And by the way, managers aren't doing great either. They're kind of disengaged as many others. And interestingly, young generations see this increasingly want to opt out of management. This is a pretty amazing statistic out of Gen Zers. They'd rather stay in an individual contributor role than become a middle manager, right? Kind of an interesting. So perhaps the problem isn't the work, right? Perhaps the problem is sort of how we manage. And this is why it matters. So picture for a moment a kind of a hierarchy of work-related capabilities, a bit like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Some of you might have heard of that. At the bottom, you have obedience. So you have people that kind of abide by the rules, right? And this is important. You can't run a large organization, certainly in the public sector, right, with that level of obedience compliance, right? Above that is diligence. You want people that kind of work hard and take responsibility for results. And at the level above that, you have expertise. You want people who have the requisite knowledge and skills to get the job done, right? So those are important. But they hardly ever create value. They're kind of commodity capabilities. And, now you can buy obedience, diligence, and intellect, across the world, like, for almost nothing. You can buy it from OpenAI. You can buy it from Google. So, you need more than that to really deliver on your mission, right? You need people who have initiative, who are not bound by a job description. You need people that they're inherently creative, who challenge the conventional wisdom and bring their imagination to work. And finally, you need people who are passionate, who see their work as something that makes a difference in the world, right? And these things, importantly, unlike the previous 3 things I mentioned, they're kind of gifts, right? They can't be commanded. You can command people to show up, but you can't necessarily command them to be creative or to be passionate. And in a way, like every leader, every organization operates in a kind of gift economy. And the things that are most important for success are things that people decide to bring to work every day or not. And as the data I showed you earlier suggests, most of them don't, right? And that's a problem. Let me give you a little bit more evidence. This time from the public sector. I pulled data from the U.S. Merit Systems Protection Board. So these are federal employees, right? But I would imagine some of this applies to state and local government as well. And the results aren't great, right? Only a fraction of people feel like they have an opportunity to grow, to develop, and contribute. And so it's not hard to reach the conclusion that most organizations kind of squander more capability than they harness. And lastly, and I promise we're going to turn to some good news soon, right? But let kind of hang in with me here because I think it's important to make the case, right? There's something that's fundamentally broken. So this is data from Gallup that shows that despite some optimism during the pandemic, when there's an opportunity in many ways as people saw it to reinvent work and the relationship between people and their workplace and so on, those numbers have been going down since then, right? And it's not because we haven't tried to make things better, right? So what gives? Like, why is this happening? And the reason why we're not making progress despite our best effort, because we're not trying to make work suck, right? Deliberately, but it still happens to to be like that. Is that because we're operating within a kind of legacy kind of model of organization and management that is no longer fit for our age, right? It's kind of stuck in this industrial era paradigm that no longer applies. And that's, my third proposition. We call this paradigm bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is a complicated term, especially in the public sector. It means all sorts of things. But when we describe it, it's really a set of practices and elements in an organization, which I think are very ubiquitous, whether it's General Motors or Department of Defense or the local Department of Environmental Protection. I think you would see these kinds of features, right? It's in a way, it's like a way to describe it. It's like a mashup of military command structures and industrial engineering. Now, you have to give bureaucracy its due, right? It's been a blessing in many ways. It's, by combining kind of managerial oversight, specialized roles, detailed rules, bureaucracy has allowed us to get control at scale, at a distance, right? And so it has enabled a lot of efficiency, which we all benefit from every day, right? But scale and efficiency are not the only things that matter to thrive, right, for an organization. And in a way, like one way to kind of sum up the problem, the dilemma we find ourselves in is that industrial era management kind of prizes some things as opposed to others. So, compliance is more valued than kind of contribution. Process is almost more important than performance, which means that adherence to a particular set of rules is more important than actually the results that get produced from that process, right? That rules are more important, kind of common sense and wisdom. That being analytical and studying a problem to death is more important or more highly valued than being audacious. And that managing to standard or plan is as opposed to making new things that delight customers or solve problems is more precious. Now, both sides of this scale are important, right? But what should be closely contested battles, right, between competing priorities instead become one-sided beatings, right? And the problem gets worse as organizations get older and they become larger. There's kind of an inflection point at which kind of bureaucracy grows faster than the organization itself, right? And you've probably seen a lot of these dynamics in your workplace where, you add layers, you add rules, these things never get sunsetted, so it's like an accretive process, right? And pretty soon you end up with an organization that is not very healthy. We call it bureausclerosis, right? It's just hard for ideas, talent, opportunities to kind of flow. And then you end up with an organization that with lower and lower achievement per capita as bureaucracy per capita goes up. Now, no organization is immune from this. And, you see this in organizations that a few decades ago, both in the public and private sector, were hailed as highly dynamic, entrepreneurial. Now they're not so much, right? So this is a pervasive problem. Now, the good news, and now I promise we turn into like the positive aspect of this presentation, the part. So we're making that shift here. The bureaucracy, this model is a choice. It's not a cosmological constant, right? And this is my fourth proposition. So there's a growing band of pioneering institutions that has essentially proven that you can get the benefits of bureaucracy, the control, the consistency, the coordination, duty free without kind of being saddled with all those kinds of incompetencies and disabilities. And you see here it's just a sampling, and a lot of these companies we profile in the book and research that we've done, and they are very diverse from each other, but in many ways they are the same, or they're what they have in common is some fundamental assumption about the relationship between people and work. So historically, at the kind of heart of traditional management models is this idea, this paradigm where you have individuals that get hired by the institution to produce products and services. And if you're in the private sector, you generate income. If you are in the public sector, it's not so much about income, but again, you're delivering products and services. And the dilemma, if you look at work this way, is that the individual is the instrument, right? And if you ever been in kind of relationship where your partner looks at you as the instrument, right? You clean up the house, you pick up the kids, whatever it is. It's not a healthy relationship, right? And I think most employees are in that kind of relationship with their employer, and that's even the simple term human resources is not very helpful, right? As a way to look at it. So what these organizations instead do is basically turn their relationship around and say, what is it? What if the institution is the instrument that we use to amplify our impact? And of course, this is the reality that Gen Z and other new generations live in, right? They look at the institution as a way to build their skills, making a dent in the world. And so this sounds like a simple shift, but it's actually, if you kind of follow through in terms of the practices that it takes you to, it's much more profound, right? Because it- you know, if you ask yourself, if you started with this premise, right, I want to create an organization that really harnesses the resilience, the passion, and the entrepreneurial energy of people, you'll end up with a very different model. And I'll just give you maybe the top 10 kind of differences, right? You'll end up with an organization where you have a flatter pyramid, and it's inverted in a way. So you have half the usual number of layers, managers, administrators, and accountability kind of flows both ways, where you have far fewer top-down mandates and rules, which doesn't mean no rules, but a lot of them don't necessarily come from the top down and they're not so prescriptive. In an organization that is much more disaggregated, it features lots of like self-directed teams. An organization that's far more lateral than vertical, where it's almost like a community of communities, where you have coordination that happens because it still needs to happen, right, at large scale, but it happens through kind of collaboration and not coordination, where staff functions are fully accountable to the business teams. They're true business partners, integral to the line and the work of the line, where leaders are expected to enable and encourage. And this is like a really important shift, right? So shifting from command and control to kind of mentor and mobilize, if you want to have another alliteration, where the value added of the leader is creating the conditions for their colleagues to thrive, as opposed to being in charge in a kind of traditional way, where resource allocation, whether it's financial resources or talent, happens very quickly. It happens across silos through very kind of fluid mechanisms and short decision making cycles, where authority and compensation correlate with the impact that you have and the value added you have, often peer attested, not necessarily your rank, right? And where control and still happens, but it happens in different ways. Instead of having a lot of like oversight and circumscribed decision rights and fear of failure, you have transparency, you have competence, you have skin in the game, so you make the right decisions. There are other ways, other guardrails that are less limiting that make sure that you're doing the right thing. And fundamentally, it's an organization where everyone feels like they own it, they own part of it. And this is, by the way, true in nonprofit sectors and in the public sector as well, where this happens. It doesn't necessarily have to do about, it has to do with equity and having a financial stake, but you feel like you are part of the organization. It's partly yours, and you're contributing in a very meaningful way. So these are like 10 defining elements of what I like to call a humanocracy. And, I'm happy to unpack these, go deeper, and provide concrete examples in the Q&A, right? In the interest of time, I'm going to try to now focus a little bit on like, what do you do about this and how do you make progress? But I hope this is an exciting vision for what our organization could become, right? As I mentioned, the question then is, fine, this is fantastic. Maybe there's some examples, but Michele, my organization is like miles away from any of these things. So like, what do we do, right? And so it sounds kind of daunting and impossible. So my fifth proposition to you is that it's entirely possible to do this. And in fact, I think it's the only way to get nonlinear improvement in performance, which brings me to my fifth and penultimate proposition. And here I'd like to give an example, recent example that I've kind of learned about and started researching recently. I love it because it's very practical, but it's also quite radical. And it involves the U.S. Army. So, like many large organizations, the Army has a lot of bureaucracy, and nowhere is this more evident in uh, procurement of new equipment, where initiatives crawl through a procedural maze. Dozens of offices need to sign off. You have all these layers that need to say yes, right? And this is how the top general during the previous administration, Mark Milley, put it, right? We're overly centralized, super bureaucratic, super risk averse, and we can't afford to do that. And it's always been a problem, but it's become an even bigger problem for the army in recent years. One of the things that the Ukraine war has shown is how outgunned yet highly innovative Ukrainian forces demonstrated how you could take commercial technologies, particularly drones, and repurpose them very quickly in the battlefield. So this idea of like a ponderous, centralized, slow-moving army was completely challenged by this kind of more nimble and open approach, right? And so the new Army Chief of Staff, General George, basically got this right away, and he basically said, "Look, we need an army that is much faster, much more creative." The other realization he got to pretty quickly is that we've tried to overhaul the system top down like a zillion ways over the last 10 years. Nothing has happened. So we need to try something completely different. So what he started with a very different question from the typical question that would guide reform. He basically said, what if we actually gave the people on the front line, the war fighters, the freedom to buy whatever they want and try to weave it into how they actually do the war fighting, as opposed to us telling them what they need, right? And so to find out the answer to this question, he launched a new initiative which is called Transforming in Contact. It started in 2023, and it's kind of a very interesting model. I'll kind of go a little deeper here. So the basic idea is this: three of the Army's 32 brigades, and these are combat teams of about 4,000 soldiers each, were chosen to participate. And they're quite different from one another. One was part of the 10th Mountain Division in New York State, and they are focused on operations and thinking about adapting for operations in Europe in cold weather, in the plains. The brigade from the 101st Airborne Division was instead focused on mobility. How do we enhance mobility with maybe lightweight vehicles and new technologies for doing reconnaissance? And the brigade from the Infantry Division, the 25th Infantry Division based in Hawaii, was really focused on flexible logistics and advanced surveillance technologies for the Pacific. So different environments, different briefs, but like no prescriptions. These are like challenges to them. And the parameters for kind of figuring out answers to these questions were pretty simple. So each brigade got $5 million that they could use however they wanted to buy new technologies, try new things. Since military budgets are very detailed and fixed from the top, the army, the chief of the army, basically chief of staff of the army, General George, had to convince Congress and the Pentagon to basically get these brigades offline and give them the freedom to redirect funds as they wanted. They To shorten decision cycles, they embedded product developers in each of these units, right? And they were be able to take feedback from the soldiers and kind of turn it into new iterations of the equipment very quickly. And then the teams were given a year to basically try new things, and then they would be kind of brought to military exercises where they would test whatever they came up with against other army units. So there would be like a real kind of verification of whether whatever they were doing made any difference. And the three benchmarks, they were going to be judged against were speed. Are you faster? Are you more flexible in sort of moving around the battlefield? And are you more lethal? Are you able to be more successful than your peers? And so they were just given this brief, and then they were let they were given all the freedom to try new things, and they came up with all sorts of really interesting innovations. So, for instance, the Third Brigade of the 10th Mountain Division, the one that is based in New York but deployed in Germany, they, the first time they met the, kind of the forces they were pitched against, they deployed 200 commercial drones, which is sort of a multiple of the maybe a dozen that you would deploy in previous kind of exercises. And they came up with all sorts of crazy, interesting deception tactics, like pairing, creating inflatable artillery decoys with $15 Raspberry Pi computers, which were programmed to mimic command post electronics. So the enemy would fire on these decoys, and they kind of expose their position. So very clever kind of kind of tactics. The Second Brigade of the 101st Airborne Division purchased 3D printers and basically produced more than 100 small drones at a fraction of the cost, that they would have had to face had they gone with established vendors. And by the way, the one on the right is one of their drones that was kind of printed right on the field with 3D parts. And now the unit trains every soldier with drone proficiency, just like they train everybody in how to use a pistol. So it's become like a kind of a core capability of every person in the unit. So those are just some of the kind of flashy examples. But beyond these, they innovated on roles and structures. Now they have people who are master drone operators who train and certify personnel on how to use drones. They have technology integration specialists who adapt and combine technologies that are off the shelf. There have new units, new reconnaissance units that have all, both drones and electronic warfare systems and even munitions, so they can actually not only spot the enemy but eliminate it right there and then. And the whole exercise was incredibly helpful in understanding what technology works and what doesn't. They tried robotic supply mules, and they found that it didn't work in rough terrain, for instance, so they kind of scratched those. And all these changes, all these insights happened because soldiers were now directly involved, right, in the decision making loop in a very kind of nimble, agile way, which is kind of sounds totally sensible, but it was very different from the typical way the stuff would happen. So this year-long experiment was a big success. So now they're scaling it to what they call transformation in contact 2.0, which is to take this level of innovation from the field and bring it up to a next level. So instead of looking at a brigade, looking at a division. So division is a collection of brigades. So we're talking now 12 to 18,000 people in a unit, and it's they have more money, they have a longer time frame, and they're the challenge is to kind of solve a more complicated problem. So doing this at scale with more pieces of equipment and so on, right? So, but it's now a kind of core part of the reform effort happening in the army. So a pretty amazing example, if you ask me. And I think there's a lot you can learn, even if you're not operating in the military from this. And let me share 4 lessons that I think are broadly applicable to management reform efforts anywhere in the public sector and beyond. The first is to trust your users, right? So organizations routinely apply design thinking for customer-facing products or services, and here I highly recommend, if you haven't done that already, to check out all the wonderful content Innovate US has on human-centered design in the public sector. It's fantastic. But I will also encourage you, apply this for your internal customers, your employees, for internal processes. And I think meaningful change requires starting by engaging those who are closest to the work, right? And removing the obstacles that prevent them from maximizing their impact. And I think, Transforming in Contact has done a really good job of that. They kind of bypassed the bureaucracy, and not only did they generate better results, but they also generate a lot more commitment from the people involved. It's actually no accident that the brigades that were involved in this effort had much higher retention rates than those that were comparable, because people felt like, again, that ownership in the work and in the reform effort. The second thing I would say is, as a lesson, is to begin small and scale wisely. One of the most clever aspects of this change that the Army pursued was starting with a small but representative sample of units. So they basically engaged 4% of their force, right? And unlike pilot projects that are largely meant to polish kind of pre-baked answers, they really encouraged the frontline soldiers to experiment and question established practices. So running the new approach alongside the existing process also helped the army and this initiative kind of face the resistance that typically comes when you're trying to change the whole thing all at once. So I thought that was really really clever and useful. The third lesson is, show don't tell, right? So instead of trying to get universal agreement before doing anything, right? Instead of trying to build consensus across the whole system, they basically decided, you know what, we're gonna try to create visible success, and then at that point, it'll be really hard for people who don't like change to push back. And this is one of my favorite quotes from General George. There are two things our bureaucracy doesn't like. One is change. The other one is to be irrelevant, right? So use the threat of irrelevance as a motivator. And finally, create space for innovation. So General George and the team were very deliberate in removing bottlenecks and encouraging units to try new things. Instead of telling them, here's what you need to do, what they use their authority to just clear the ground, the space, so that they could try new things, right? And it was this kind of commitment to bottom up innovation and a healthy dose of humility, right? Because they went in and said, like, we don't have the answers. The answers will have to come from you, soldiers, right? That gave the front line the confidence to take new risks. So anyway, I hope you find this kind of example, which is still going on right now, interesting. Now, what does this all mean for you, right? And this is my last proposition. For me, it's yes, you can. And that's the last message I want to leave you with, which is you can start to make a dent on making the organization you work in more vital, more innovative, more flexible, no matter who you are in the organization. You don't have to be the head of your agency or department or the equivalent of General George, although obviously if you are, that would help. And I have three pieces of practical advice for you. And I'm going to close with this and try to go through this relatively quickly so we have time for Q&A. So the first thing is to start with your teams, with your unit, whatever the perimeter of action is for you. And here's one way you might want to get started. So spend a half a day a week for the next month or so interviewing your colleagues and understand how this kind of bureaucratic kind of system feels to them, right? So you can ask them things like, as you think about the performance of your team, the way the team works, what do you see every day that blurs accountability, that slows people down, that doesn't contribute to impact, doesn't really add any value, that makes people less courageous, makes them feel like they don't really have a stake, they don't really have a voice, that makes them much more parochial, impedes collaboration, whatever. I mean, there's lots of ways you can kind of tee this up, right? And listen to what they have to tell you. And better yet, ask them a second question. What is one thing that we could do right now to reduce or remove this barrier to achievement? And the goal is to give everyone the opportunity to make the organization, more capable, have them involved in the change process. Now, second, once you've done that, you maybe take some of these frustrations, take some of these ideas, and run an experiment to find better alternatives. Prototype the new ways of working, just like the way you would prototype a new product or a service. And let me give you an example from a pharma company that we studied. So this was from about 15 years ago. So a group of mid-level managers was searching for ways to reduce bureaucracy. There were lots of targets in the company, but they landed on travel planning and expense policies, which I'm sure you'll be very surprised to hear were as frictionless as a rug burn, right? And there are all sorts of guidelines on who could travel, for what purposes, and which airlines, what class. Similar story for hotels and food. And one manager told us, like, I'm responsible for a $70 million budget, but I still have to check whether I get reimbursed for a $3 cup of coffee. It's ridiculous. It's infantilizing. Why do we have to do this? So here's how they approach the problem. They set up an experiment with a treatment and a control group. After all, it's a pharma company, right? They have about 200 people split between these, and the treatment groups could make their own travel arrangements for about 90 days, no pre-trip authorizations, no post-trip audits, do whatever you want. The catch was this: all your expenses, because they needed this for tax purposes, would need to be paired with receipts, right? So you need to show us what you spent the money on, and more importantly, this stuff will be online for everyone to see, right? So the idea was that sunlight was going to be the best disinfectant. It would also simplify planning, reduce frustration, and not necessarily impact costs too much, right? So they ran this, as I said, for like 90 days, and then after that, they looked at the results. The least surprising part of this is that, obviously people were spending less time doing this kind of compliance work. More surprising was that almost half of the people involved thought that this simple rule change made a big difference to their overall job satisfaction. And what do you think happened to costs? Right? The interesting thing about that is that the cost for the treatment group went down a little bit, not much, but noticeably, and remained unchanged for the control group, right? So this is a simple example, but I think it offers a lesson on how to challenge a kind of boneheaded policy. Like instead of moaning about it, you can hack it. You can try to test a new alternative in a way that is risk bounded and doesn't require 50 sign-offs from the CEO, right? Because they do. This is a company with tens of thousands of employees, and they started with 200. All right. The last tip I would give you is to make this social. So enlist other people. Don't feel like it's just on you. So to activate a pro-human movement, recruit colleagues, because there are plenty of people that are probably as dissatisfied as you are and who are keen to get involved. And here, my favorite public sector example comes from the UK and the National Health Service, or NHS. They employ over 1.5 million people. They see, I think, 1 million people every day, and they're one of the world's most hierarchical organizations and kind of bureaucratic. And for decades, they've resisted any attempt at kind of top-down change and improvement. And the British love the NHS, but they also wish it was so much better, and there's so much opportunity to improve. And the story I wanted to tell you very quickly starts with Helen Bevan. And she was an experienced change leader in the Quality Improvement Office of the NHS. And she'd been part of a lot of top-down change programs. And her genius was to see that instead of like maybe rolling out change to everyone, maybe the NHS should try to roll it up and involve tens of thousands of people in the change process. And one of the things she did, she's launched many change initiatives, but one of the early ones that really kind of propelled her to kind of fame and impact was Change Day. So this is a simple website that asks NHS workers to pledge one specific action they could take to improve patient care. She and a group of medical assistants figured this out, and they launched it without any permission. There's no budget, nothing. She just basically went public with this, and and people were invited to participate, but there's like no expectation that. In fact, they had no idea how many people would. Well, in the first year when they did this, they ran this for like like a week or two. They got almost 200,000 pledges. Things like physicians promising to taste children's medicine before prescribing it, making sure it tastes good, or procurement teams clearing out redundant supplies to free workspace for clinicians. You can imagine hundreds of, almost 200,000 kinds of pledges of this kind. When they did it the second year, they got almost 1 million. They got 800,000 pledges. It became the largest, most successful change initiative in the NHS, and it spawned similar efforts in over 20 countries around the world. So I think it's a really interesting example. There's a lot that you can learn from it. And by the way, Agueda, I think Helen Bevan would be a wonderful speaker at a future Innovate US event. So maybe we could talk about that. But maybe the last thing I wanted to leave you with is this, that really comes from the Helen's example, which is that everyone, like Helen Bevan and her compatriots who got involved with her on Change Day, saw themselves and must see themselves as a potential change leader. In the face of new challenges that we're all facing in our organizations, everyone must step up and act. And my hope is that today's session, however short it was, kind of convinced you that we don't need to wait for permission to start building organizations that we deserve, and that you'll leave this session kind of more inspired and perhaps even ready to begin. So that's it for now. Thank you so much. I hope this was helpful, and now I look forward to our discussion.